All right, and it's 2 p.m. I will go straight to the introduction then. Hello, everybody, 65 participants and counting. Welcome to the National Association of Scholars webinar, A Book Too Risky to Publish, a memorial discussion in honor of Professor James Flynn. We're very sad that Professor Flynn passed away last December, and we're very proud to host a memorial discussion. So this webinar, we're delighted to have Charles Murray, the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Paul du Quenoy, publisher of Academica Press, and Amy Wax, Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars. Before we jump into the discussion, which will, I believe, be Paul du Quenoy first, then Amy Wax, then Charles Murray, then moderated discussion, then question and answers, I'll just say, everybody should put their questions into the chat or the Q&A at the bottom. This will either be conveyed by me or sent read directly by the participants. Any questions that aren't answered during the course of this event, please send to me afterwards, randall@nas.org. I can convey queries to the panelists. And finally, this is being recorded and will be available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. Thank you all so much. Dr. du Quenoy.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Charles and Amy, for joining us today, and especially to Charles for endorsing Jim Flynn's book, which I have a copy of right here. I thought, as the publisher of the book, I would talk today about the circumstances of the original book's cancellation and how Academica Press came to publish it, and then offer some observations about what that would tell us about cancel culture and also about the fate of the American, or if you will, Anglospheric university. As is widely known, I think by now, Jim Flynn was a very distinguished scholar of intelligence and largely built his career in New Zealand. He was a man of the political left, in fact, of the political far left. He had been a member of the American Socialist Party. He was twice fired from academic positions in the early 1960s for advocating free speech positions and civil rights, and had to go to New Zealand, where he built his entire career and lived the rest of his life. He remained very much a committed man of the left. He ran for public office in New Zealand as a candidate for far left New Zealand political parties, actually to the left of the Labour Party, which is now the government there. But he started to notice, as he got involved in his intelligence research, that his words and actions were controversial. And as a result of that, he came up with the idea very late in his career. He published this book when he was 85. He, of course, died in December at the age of 86. He decided that he would write a book on free speech in universities. And the first title, the original title of the book, was In Defense of Free Speech, the University as Censor. He received a contract from a respectable British publisher. I'm not sure why he wanted to do it in the UK, but it was a respectable British publisher. It was accepted, processed, finished, advertised in their September 2019 catalog. And then Jim received a letter, which we've actually reprinted in the preface front matter of the book, saying that it's too controversial, it's incendiary, it could cause potential legal problems for us in the UK, it could damage us, the publisher's image, and we're not going to publish it after all. Sorry. And if you're familiar with academic culture, and I was a university professor for 15 years before I inherited my company, usually in a situation like that, in the situations I've been in, the advice was do nothing, say nothing, suck it up, avoid conflict, don't get involved, certainly don't stand up for yourself ever, or for anyone else, which is almost always what happens. Charles and Amy, I think, can talk more about that later. Jim wasn't like that at all. He was a man of great principle, and he was also at the end of his career. So he went on the Australian-based site Quillette and wrote an article, a very moving article, about his book's cancellation and what he thought it meant for the current state of academia. I read the article on Quillette and contacted him. So did 14 other publishers, all offering a home for Jim's book. He chose Academica Press, as he explains in the book, because we are not a politically aligned press. In fact, most of our books have nothing to do with politics. We don't have a political orientation within the press. And he really didn't want to go with these right-wing outfits who approached him. There are right-wing publishers who do this, largely because once you do that, once you cross that line, it's like painting a great red X on your back and saying, I'm a conservative, please target me, which he wasn't a conservative, but he didn't want to be a target either. And your book gets dismissed as a right-wing publication that's not worthy of consideration or simply ignored, which I think is more often the case. So he chose us for that reason, and we were able to get the book out by Christmas of that year, which in the world of publishing is quite a feat. This is actually one of our claims to fame, is that we can actually do a book very, very quickly. And it was easier with Jim's because he actually had the finished text, the finished copy, what his UK publisher would have presented, and it only needed sort of minor editing. But we were able to do that very quickly. I remember signing off on it on a sailboat in the Caribbean because it was such an urgent project for us. And we did in fact get this through. So that's how the book came to us. And what I think this tells us about cancel culture, we read almost daily these items about some cultural artifacts or work of art or person indeed who is framed for cancellation, for elimination from the public sphere, to be minimized, to be subject to some kind of warning or contextualization, as the modish term holds it, to tell you why this is bad, why you shouldn't like it, and why you should be very wary of, for example, watching the Muppets. To cite an example of the last couple of weeks. Or which Dr. Seuss books shouldn't be published and why, right? And usually that makes for great outrage copy. It's very easy to be a right-wing journalist and say that this is deplorable and how can anybody not say this is deplorable. But what happens with this is you don't really get at the reasons why or if there's any way out of that. And I think Jim answered that through his actions much more than through his words. You can't be canceled unless you let them cancel you. And that's what Jim really believed. And we talked about this at some length. And he did go public. He did not like what happened to him. The publisher was embarrassed. I remember when we announced the book on Twitter, we actually mentioned the publisher by name and linked the Twitter handle or whatever that's called and said, we're publishing the book and it's now found a great home. And they actually put what I think was probably an embarrassed like on our Twitter post because Jim had stood up. And what I can tell you now more than a year later, 15 months after we published the book, we have never had a single negative comment about it, about anything in it. We've never been under any pressure to minimize it, to remove it from publication, to have any sort of problem. And as a result, we've developed a kind of minor industry at the press of saving books that have been canceled or books that are in danger of cancellation, books that would be unpopular for a political point of view, and making sure that they see the light of day. And the way our press works is really quite simple. We did, for example, put in a bid for Woody Allen's memoirs when Hachette canceled them about a year ago. And he went with another publisher, but it was important to me to make sure that we were known as an organization that stands up for free speech. It helps that one of the first actions I had when I took over the company was to abolish my editorial committee. So no editorial committee, no complaints. And Hachette's cancellation of Woody Allen, and in other cases, you find this as well, it's largely an employee effort. We've seen this also recently in the New York Times, where the kind of lower level employees rebel against the more senior people. It's called at the Times the revolt of the 20-year-olds against the 40-year-olds. But to be quite honest, my solution to that was to outsource most of my editing to India, where they don't have those sensibilities. So it has never come up. No work we've ever done has been controversial among our staff. And frankly, if it were, I'd fire them all and hire a new millennial editorial staff. It wouldn't take 10 minutes, especially now, right? And so there's no reason to get into this. And if you stand up, like any group of bullies, they back down. They just go away. If you actually resist what they're trying to do to you, then you don't play their game. Right? You fight this. And we see this not only in academia, but in the professions and journalism and entertainment. If you really come out swinging, then you will survive. if you go through these aching apologies, this sort of, oh, I'm so sorry for anybody whose feelings they may have hurt, they're just going to smell blood and come at you like so many sharks. So there is a real path of resistance to cancel culture, and that's something that I very firmly believe in. And I think examining these cases, disparate cases throughout our society, has led in that direction, that we really have had a way forward. What do I think it means for the university? Jim was a very good-natured man. And like most of these books that are critical of academia, at the end he offers prognostications and also sort of like ideas about ways to defend free speech in universities to make sure that some of these hateful recent trends can be reversed. And what he does, though, is he offers these nice palliatives, and maybe they'll work. My personal view is that it's impossible. And I think that what's happening with this is that it's not really what the woke movements are not really elevating students or professors or minorities or whichever aggrieved group you wish to assign, but rather they're depreciating the value of universities. And the one jarring statistic I'll give you is that 40 years ago, 95% of Americans believed that a university education was essential to success in the modern world. Today, last year, that figure had declined to 45%. So the credibility of our entire academic establishment is in serious decline. In my own discipline, I was a history professor. The number of people majoring in history has fallen in half in just the last 10 years, following on a slower decline over previous decades. We're now training a fraction of history students compared to what we would have done 40 or 50 years ago. And the most precipitous decline has been, I don't think coincidentally, correlating to the woke movement, to critical race theory, to the real changes that we're seeing in university education. I don't see any way out of it. If you don't buy into this movement, if you speak out against it, you're taking major risks to your career. And at the same time, there are other ways to obtain that education. One of the things I marvel at as a publisher is the complete success of military history, for example, outside of the academy. We have basically abandoned it in our universities, but the top selling history books are consistently books about World War II, biographies of people like Winston Churchill, all the things you're not supposed to like as a humanities scholar or social scientist, biographies of great men, books about war, books about diplomacy, are in fact immensely popular and have a huge readership. It just happens increasingly to be outside of universities. And if you really are a curious and intelligent person, it is entirely possible to get a very good understanding of almost any event in history if you can simply use YouTube. Because there are very, very good programs for this now. If you're interested in the content rather than the degree, that this is something you can do and actually find that sort of thing. So in the meantime, the academic historians, the so-called university-based historians, my former colleagues, are withering away into what I would say is, and this is my discipline, so I don't feel bad about saying it, total irrelevance. There's just nothing to them. And I really think that we will see a substantial change. I have a 5-year-old son. When he goes to college in 13 years, he will probably be looking at a very different academic landscape than what we've known at any recent time, certainly than what we know today. And I think that's sort of natural. We have had some form of higher education in the West for 1,000 years. And to argue that it reached its final point in North America around the year 1975 seems to me to be a bit naive. Like, these things do change and evolve in all sorts of directions and in response to all sorts of pressures. And I do think we're looking at a systemic crisis. So I think, and in fact, National Association of Scholars did trends in universities and where does the money go from all these fantastic tuition rates. Largely it's to administration. And administration is showing increasingly little intellectual leadership, very little dynamism in terms of how they approach the university. And they just sort of give in to all these trends to look like they're part of this, cool kid club of wokeness and signaling the correct virtues that they feel they need to stay alive. So I'll end there. I think I've gone over my 10 minutes. But I'm sure Charles and Amy will have a lot to say about this, so I'll leave the rest of the discussion to them.
Thank you so much. I believe Amy comes second. Amy. Oh, you're still muted, Amy. Sorry, you're still muted. You need to okay.
I'm not very adept with this Zoom thing, but now I think you can hear me. So I'm unmuted here.
Yes.
Okay. So it's impossible, I think, to do justice to Flynn, his stellar career, of course, his wide-ranging book in this few minutes. So I'm just going to use it to make a few observations. First, I am grateful to Flynn for his detailed historical overview, reviewing how conflicts over dissent and freedom of opinion, both in academia and society, is really a long-standing phenomenon, has historically come from both the left and the right. Now, today, as we know, the universities and other opinion-shaping power centers are overwhelmingly captured by left-leaning forces, and those of us who are not with the program are the ones who are struggling to be heard. We're in danger of canceling. But in the past, it is conservative forces that have resisted challenges to conventional understandings and ideas, and have even advocated for penalties for their expression. And there is a significant thread in conservative thought that emphasizes the need to maintain a shared consensus, to stabilize society, to reinforce what is considered a desirable way of life. And there have always been conservative intellectuals who see a place, however limited, for some kind of orthodoxy or set of precepts that are foundational. And we can argue, of course, they have argued over what that content of those precepts is, and one could talk about it for hours. But in our brief time, I think there is an important lesson to be drawn from this observation. And that is that an approach to free thought that is purely what I call proceduralist, that relies on abstract neutral principles of debate and free speech to save conservative values, has obvious limitations. Those commitments can be used for us, but in other circumstances, they also are used against us. And in fact, that happens today. So consider Michelle Goldberg's piece in the New York Times not long ago, attacking the conservative, quote, campaign to cancel wokeness. And she argues that the wokeness litany of name calling and accusations and all the rest simply represents an exercise of free speech, no different from the opinions that they're responding to. And I think the point here is that a defense of open debate and academic values, which Flynn embarks on very ably and perhaps does as good a job as anyone can, will take us only so far and will not save us. There is no substitute for the hard work of making substantive, reasoned, evidence-based arguments for our key ideas and precious values. And here I'm talking about the meritocracy, individual responsibility, colorblindness, the traditional family, rule of law, just the whole list. We could go on and on. And of course, that defense is very hard work, and no one knows better than the people in charge of organizing this event, the National Association of Scholars, which has done yeoman's work in this regard. And this is no criticism of Flynn. It was not his remit to defend these values, but and we're very grateful for his defense of them. But I think, at least for me, the history that he so painstakingly recounts is very, to me, very enlightening and eye-opening. My second observation relates to the example that Flynn himself sets for the kind of courteous, respectful discourse that enables dissenters to express their views, reasoned debates to take place, and truth to be discovered. And this ties into the theme of shared values and a basic consensus, which is absolutely necessary to hold together a polity or a cohesive community with a common purpose, and that includes an academic community. One of Flynn's key insights is his recognition that wide open debate about important ideas does not belong in every setting or doesn't sit easily in every setting, that nurturing the possibility of courteous disagreement may require that it be cabined or confined to certain settings. And he reminds us that in any cohesive and peaceable society, different social goods and purposes are, quote, distributed among separate social institutions. There are many contexts in which controversial ideas are wisely avoided or at least soft-pedaled. And of course, there are wide subcultural differences in people's willingness to address contentious issues in ordinary social discourse. My experience has taught me that some people stick to the weather, the garden, and the dogs, whereas others will think nothing of asking you your views on abortion when you walk in the door. Now, Flynn mentions gatherings at the local pub, an establishment that he says is, quote, mainly devoted to happiness or conviviality. He adds that, quote, anyone who would launch into a debate about race and IQ in that setting just doesn't understand what a pub is all about. Now, I think this observation shows that Flynn understands that even in the most laudably tolerant of societies, which ours at this point most certainly is not, people do hold strong convictions and fervent commitments, and of course, many good societies are that way. But that means that tolerance always rests on what he terms, quote, fragile foundations. I would add that tolerance will often be grudging. This is not unhealthy. Grudging tolerance is a formula for social peace, especially in a society as diverse as ours. Yet many people today seem to have forgotten this insight, and our society is not the better for it. Wherever we look, we see a flattened moral landscape where every contentious issue elicits angry demands for passionate condemnation or, in the alternative, unconditional surrender. And that is why the university and what happens there is so important, as Flynn most decidedly thinks that it is. A good society, Flynn declares, designates the university as the primary institution for the pursuit of truth. And that truth can only be pursued where the mind is free and debate is robust and wide open. So the university must serve as a safe space for uninhibited expression and full autonomy of thought, without scruples and niceties, without the fear of offending based on ethnic identity or other constraints. I should add, and I think Flynn would agree based on what he has written, that this doesn't mean that the academy is a total free-for-all. It has or ought to have its rules, its protocols, its limits, its standards of rigor, logic, evidence, analytic objectivity, all the restraints which we know make for a fair fight and are conducive to the best results. And of course, the conversation should be as courteous and dispassionate as possible, and we should resist demonizing and attacking those who disagree. Of course, nothing like Flynn's idea of the academy prevails today. His vision is distinctly countercultural and becoming more so, at least in the English-speaking world. Which brings me to a topic with which Flynn has been preoccupied in his academic work on behavioral genetics for quite some time: the interplay of innate endowments and environment in influencing human behavior, and especially intelligence. In reviewing recently Freddie DeBoer's book, The Cult of Smart, I was reminded once again that many on the left still resist the idea that genetic factors contributed to cognitive ability. And when it comes to group differences, the resistance is even stauncher. A recent survey of university students and scholars reveals that a clear majority, actually something upwards of 70%, believe that speakers arguing for innate group differences in intelligence or other important capabilities should be completely banished from campus. I recently was asked at a forum on free inquiry whether we shouldn't just avoid that topic altogether. And of course, there are scholars who have long advocated for such a ban. Flynn clearly is not one of them. No empirical questions pertinent to human behavior or capacity should be off limits for Flynn, and I agree with him. But the reason I believe that examining these topics should not be verboten is not just because I'm a free inquiry hawk, but also because I have concluded that suppressing research on the genetics of individual and group differences inevitably distorts all of the human behavior and biological sciences across the board. And I am not the only one who thinks so. When asked recently to express one wish for the future of the field of behavioral psychology, Steven Pinker stated that no human behavioral research should be conducted or published that fails to acknowledge, examine, and control for potential genetic contributions to the outcome or behavior being studied. Now, behavior and social science today certainly does not live up to that standard. There is an overwhelming body of badly designed research in which genetic explanations for observed effects or behaviors or correlation is not controlled for and sometimes not even mentioned. Recently, I delved into the neuroscience of deprivation, and I've written about that. Multiple studies that look at the brains and behavior of disadvantaged children fail to examine the possibility, fail to even acknowledge the possibility that observed deficits might result from parent-to-child genetic transmission, maybe of some of the very traits that lead to poverty and neglect in the first place, rather than from the environmental influence of parental deprivation. Now, some of these studies might be valid, but they are just as likely to be misleading. What is driving this blind spot is, in my view, a fear of highlighting the influence of innate individual differences and, of course, finding evidence of innate group differences. But this fear cannot be easily walled off and cabined. It distorts and debases research in areas ranging from intelligence to education to occupational achievement to the roots of poverty to criminality and more. And the price we pay for this selective ignorance is not just bad research, but bad policies. Policies that waste resources, create unrealistic expectations, and fuel the animosities and conflicts surrounding race and gender relations in our society. What is to be done? I also am not optimistic that things will improve. Quite the opposite. Flynn was courteous, calm, and dispassionate in confronting these issues and urged others to be the same. But today in academia, which is dominated by work progressives, these attributes are hard to find. We cannot find Flynn's brave counterpart, no matter how hard we look. Fewer and fewer researchers and scholars are willing to risk the ostracism and vilification and the outright cancellation that awaits those who wade into these fields and dare to come to the wrong conclusions. And of course, we have the recent evidence of Gregory Clark in the UK. I wish I had a solution to this problem, but I don't. And I am genuinely sad and disappointed that Flynn's inspiring and honorable legacy is today being honored less and less. Thank you.
And thank you. We'll go now to our third speaker, Dr. Charles Murray.
Never been a professor. Jim Flynn was unique, as Amy has suggested. He was constantly when he was in front of audiences that wanted him to champion their cause, Jim insisted on being polite to me when we were on a debate. And it was quite clear that he didn't consider me to be evil, that I was making points that needed to be taken seriously and so forth. He was a real treasure in that regard. And all the more so because his politics were not subtle. As was pointed out at the outset of the gathering, he was a man of the left. He didn't let that get in his way of his passion for trying to figure out how things worked and being willing to subject his own views to scrutiny. So I also have a personal relationship with Jim that grew out of the fact that Dick Herrnstein and I named the Flynn effect in the bell curve. And one of the odd things about the reaction to the bell curve is to hear someone say, oh, that the bell curve, the authors didn't understand the existence of this thing called the Flynn effect. And that's why its findings are completely invalid. And I have to point out, we named the Flynn effect. I'm not going to talk anymore about Jim right now because I want to get to a broad theme that I am going to, I hope, pick up more detail about in the Q&A and discussion that follows. And that is that I think that the whole free speech issue and the whole campus culture is heading toward a new phase that will develop over this decade. Right now, it is, can the social scientists cow other social scientists into going along with the orthodoxy? I'll step back for a second. What do I mean by the orthodoxy? I mean the mantra. Sex is a social construct. Excuse me, gender is a social construct. Race is a social construct. And class is a function of privilege. And that whenever we see differences in outcomes in economic or social or cultural measures of success and failure, that these are artificial. And that any group differences that exist are the result of systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic classism, and the function of white privilege. Right now, they are doing a good job of making life miserable for other sociologists, other political scientists, other economists on their faculties. They are doing a good job of making them scared to stick their heads up. What we are looking at coming down the pike this decade is, can they cow the hard sciences? And what I want to give you just a brief sense of in these few minutes is the degree to which so much more is known by geneticists and neuroscientists about these issues that has ever not only not reached the public press, but look, I have a lot of professors in this audience in the social sciences. And I think an awful lot of what's going on in neuroscience and genetics has not crossed your radar screen. I mean, why should it have? Because none of the materials you ordinarily encounter will be talking about it. Let me just back into a framework for thinking about this. And I'm borrowing here from Robert Trivers, who pointed out that the sciences form a hierarchy. Physics rests on mathematics, chemistry rests on physics, biology rests on chemistry, and ultimately the social sciences rest in biology. That is simply a truism. If you believe in creation, in evolution, if you are not a creationist, you have to say, yeah, after hundreds of millions of years of evolution and selection pressures for different kinds of things that make it more likely you will pass on your genes than other characteristics, human beings will have evolved certain characteristics that are deeply embedded in biology. It's common sense. Everybody ought to realize that the resistance of the social sciences to that has been incredible, as Amy herself described. In fact, we know a whole lot already. Let me just run through a few of the things that we know already. Gender is a social construct. Are men and women really different for genetic reasons in their attraction to certain kinds of occupations? Are there genetic reasons for stereotypical differences in female emotions and personality traits versus male emotions and personality traits? Well, the answer is, in terms of what the neuroscientists and the geneticists are finding, is, well, this sometimes yes and sometimes no, but on a wide variety of important dimensions, there are differences that manifest themselves in different overlapping distributions. And for once, I have an audience which I assume can deal with the concept of overlapping distributions. That just because you have a difference in means does not mean that all men are on one side and all women are on the other side, or all blacks are on one side and all Asians on another side. You have powerfully overlapping distributions, but you do have differences. So for example, on the fraught question of are male and female brains different, among the neuroscientists, it is conventional wisdom to say, well, yeah, of course, in a whole bunch of ways. And we know what a lot of those ways are. We know that the male brain is masculinized by prenatal surges of testosterone, and one soon after birth, which permanently changed the organization of the male brain. This is not some new fringe position. It was first discovered in the late 1950s as a possibility, and has subsequently been investigated in great detail by the neuroscientists. And with the new techniques available to them, they have gone a lot further in documenting exactly what's going on. Do women and men have different functions in the brain dealing with emotions? Yeah. And you can pinpoint subregions of the brain that are involved in them. They're learning more and more steadily about the specific mechanisms. Are male brains more lateralized than female brains? Are they optimized for communication within hemispheres, whereas women are optimized for communication between hemispheres? Yeah, that's known too. In all of these things, progress has been very rapid and continues to be very rapid. But the Cordelia Fines of the world, Cordelia Fine is the author of a couple of best-selling books on the fact that on all of the fraudulent pseudosciences represented by the neuroscience I've just alluded to. Aside from a few popularizers like her, the serious neuroscientists, male and female alike, are working out of a body of knowledge that is secure, that is constantly being enhanced, but that just leaves the idea that gender is a social construct deep in the dust. Race. If you talk to a social scientist, they think that the understanding of race is exactly what Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould said it was, that there is so little variation, human variation, that is between races as opposed to within races, that you can't possibly have any meaningful phenotypic differences. And anyway, human beings dispersed from Africa so recently that there hasn't been time for important evolution to have taken place. No and no. First, the fact that most human variation is within races rather than between them is true. But for that matter, the genetic overlap between chimpanzees and human beings, for that matter, between earthworms and human beings is also very high, and there are important phenotypic differences there. It's called Lewontin's fallacy now, and it's been established as Lewontin's fallacy for many, many years. And population geneticists don't worry about that sort of thing. Can you discriminate among human populations in ways that correspond to their self-identified ethnicity? Yes. How do you think 23andMe can return to you in exchange for $100 a very detailed profile of your ethnic ancestry? It's a well-established technology, and now a very inexpensive technology. Has there been time for evolution to take place since humans dispersed from Africa? Yeah, it turns out this was a surprise. All right, Stephen Jay Gould was acting on good information when he stuck to the concept of evolution occurring by mutation. Evolution by mutation takes forever. But it turns out, and this is within the last 20 or 30 years that this has been established, a great deal of important evolution occurs in standing variation. So you have differences in terms of the genetic material, and a change in the environment then can lead to a quite rapid effects on the phenotype. By quite rapid, I mean some thousands of years, but only a few thousand years. And furthermore, it has been well established that this kind of differential selection pressure has been occurring primarily in different ways in different continents. So At this point, Amy talked about the fraud issue of race and IQ. Well, they have identified, the geneticists have several hundred, by this time probably a couple of thousand, genetic variants that bear on cognitive ability. And they explain an interesting proportion of the variants. And these are correlated. Now, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds in terms of the jargon. You have these variants that have allele frequencies, all right? And within continental populations, these allele frequencies for, let's say, the variants bearing on IQ are about 0.98 and 0.99. That's true within East Asians. It's true within people of South African, Sub-Saharan African ancestry, so forth. When you look between continents, those correlations run about 0.6, 0.7. And as those of you in the audience who do scatter plots of data, when you have correlations of 0.6 or 0.7, you can see for yourself the degree to which that leaves a lot of room for phenotypic difference to develop. I've gone into this to give you a sense, because I've just scratched the surface, to give you a sense of the degree to which real heresy is going on out there in genetics and neuroscience by people who have no desire to be heretics, but they are fascinated by the scientific issues. Now, here's the collision that's coming down the pike. And I'm not going to give you confident predictions about how it's going to play out, but here's what's going to happen. The hard sciences are finding out all sorts of things that bear on questions that historically have been the province of the soft sciences, whether it's IQ or whether it's personality traits, whether it's criminal behavior, you name it. At some point, the social scientists are either going to have to incorporate that or they will become silly in the eyes of the hard scientists. They will become a joke. We're actually a lot closer to that than most people realize. Quick example. Raj Chetty, a Harvard professor, has assembled incredible databases using IRS data that enable incredibly fine-grained analyses of a variety of economic and social phenomena right down to the block level, let alone the zip code level. It's a great database. It's a wonderful database. But almost all of the conclusions that have been published so far, to my knowledge, all of the conclusions that have been published so far from this database have not been informed by genomic information about the people who live in those blocks. Now, how you go about gathering that is one problem, but I am saying, and I'm echoing something Amy said here, unless you have some of that information, an awful lot of the implications that you draw from the phenotypic correlational analyses is going to be completely wrong. Because unless you know the group differences that are playing into the patterns in the data, causal inference becomes not only impossible, you're very likely to be led down the wrong path. Well, that's only just the surface, but the short statement is, we are looking at a decade that will probably decide whether the university as we know it, have known it historically, is going to evolve in one in which you have a serious university, which consists of the hard sciences, and a collection of additional faculty members who are just have no real relevance to any important questions, or whether you are going to see the social sciences suck it up and incorporate biology into their analysis of the social science issues that have preoccupied them. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you, so much. Now, the next part is to be a conversation, and I don't actually want to guide this too much. Do any of you want to pick up on anything any of the other three have said, and just sort of start a conversation yourselves?
I'm good
I
right now.
want to make a brief comment about Charles' last point of the tensions in academia, in the behavioral human sciences, with some of the findings of biological sciences and genomics, I think those tensions are going to increase. And I am stunned at the way in which this research is going on. Going to the International Society for Intelligence Research convention and meetings is an eye-opener, because people are very much looking into this stuff. But it'll be fascinating to see how it plays out on campus, because there is so much resistance to acknowledging genetic influence in these areas. It just, I don't know how it's going to work, really.
Yeah, and if I could add something as well, without having discussed this before, all three of us came to the conclusion that the future of academia is, at the very least, highly uncertain, and at the most, really quite dire. And this seems to be a consensus view of our panel today. And again, I just don't see any way forward. I really don't think the current systems of information transmission that we have in the universities can last. Just can't.
I'm going to actually, well, I will jump in with a question then. One question, of course, is how influential is the American model on international academia, international science? In effect, if the cancel culture and rejection of science takes over America, what parts of the rest of the academic world will it take over, and what parts will resist?
I'd like to jump in on that. I'm unmuted still, right?
Yes.
In many ways, England and the continent are just as bad as we are. Certainly, England is. England has a lot of exactly the same problems we have with cancel culture. The Chinese are completely unaffected by this, and you have an awful lot of intellectual talent in China. And they are completely unrestrained as to the kinds of questions they can ask. And they also have very lavish resources for studying a lot of these. And by the way, some Chinese, American Chinese, have gone back to China just because they're so much freer to do their work than they are here. And they have so much better resources and facilities to do it. So you very possibly are going to have a situation where American universities lose their preeminence in the social sciences and actually probably suffer some damage to their preeminence in biology as well, because there already have been constraints on the work that can be done by biologists without running afoul of the orthodoxy. But at some point, okay, let me just put it in a graphic sense. Suppose the Chinese come up with ways of doing gene editing that can enhance the IQ of a baby by an anticipated 15 points. I'm just making that up, but I'm saying, suppose that happens. Do you think there will be any market for that technology among the affluent in the United States, among parents who try to wring every single bit of neural stimulation they can out of the environment in which their children grow up? You're damn right there will be a market for it. And so you will have certain things that will be happening as a result of progress that's made in other parts of the world that may not persuade the orthodox in the United States to change their ways, but will simply make the universities that act that way more and more irrelevant.
I agree. And I think also I see more positive signs very recently in Europe. In France, for example, the actual president of the Republic recently denounced critical race theory, which is a bit ironic because it was essentially French in its origins. It was Derrida, and it was these French intellectuals who created it. It was adapted to a large extent by the American Academy. And now that it's filtering back into French universities, it's been described by the government as a threat to the cohesion of the Republic and of French society, and something that needs to be resisted. Also in the UK, within the last couple of weeks, a government bill has been passed to regulate free speech in universities. That if a university should, for example, clamp down on free speech, it will face significant financial consequences. And there have been people advocating something like that in the United States. But my observation is that the conservative leadership, or let's just say the free thought hawks, as Amy nicely said, aren't really organized enough to make this a policy, and the political leadership largely just doesn't care. It's just not an important issue on the American right. And that's something that would have to change in order for there to be a larger effect in our own educational establishments.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here and say it's very hard to get a handle on how woke Europe is, because I think it varies quite a lot. It's a dynamic situation. You know, they're not as diverse a society. As immigration makes them more diverse, they're going to, I think, be confronting this more and more. But I think America has already lost its preeminence by certain measures in social science and in some of the hard sciences. I recently saw some data that the top scientists for citations, the United States has lost ground in their percentage of top scientists for citations, even in our best universities, and are being outpaced and outgunned by places like Holland, New Zealand, Australia. This doesn't surprise me at all, because I think our social sciences are already a debased field. I think the real danger is in fields like economics. Economics is worth watching, because economics until recently was a very rigorous, matter-of-fact, un-PC field, and it has been just taken over by woke activists, and it has also been feminized, or as there is an effort to feminize it. And I think economics is the next field that's going to go. And of course, the hard sciences are in terrible danger. Academic medicine has just swung from being a conservative bastion to being the most woke part of the university. So it's changing rapidly.
Though you do have one countervailing force in the in medicine, Amy, and that is that it is known that different populations, the technical geneticists never use the word race anymore, by the way. They use the word populations, and that's actually makes sense, because there are a lot of technical reasons that you should talk about ancestral populations. But the fact is, ancestral populations respond differently to different drugs. They have different vulnerabilities to disease. And most of the large genomic databases have been overwhelmingly European. You also now have some big databases of East Asians, but the ones of sub-Saharan Africa are still pretty spotty. And so it has become an issue of the left to say this is racist, that you can't do precision medicine and respond to the needs of Africans unless you start getting much larger samples of Africans. And they're right. But this pressure to do that is going to mean that you can't take a database of 300,000 Africans and expect people with who all have their genome sequenced, and expect researchers to restrict themselves to variants that involve blood pressure. They're going to start looking at everything. And so this whole issue is a Pandora's box that in some ways the Orthodox are in the process of pushing open themselves.
Nifty, thank you. I'm going to switch at this point to some questions from the audience, because, you know, they need a say too. And to the audience members, I'm going not chronologically, just some of a number of these questions. Blame me if I don't get to you. I think some of these are interesting. So I'm going to start with a question for Professor de Quenoy. Has your publishing company received manuscripts on Middle East politics and history? If so, were you concerned about possible pressures from liberal radical critics? I noticed that you taught at the American University of Beirut for many years, presumably by Googling your background. Did the AUB faculty feel that they had academic freedom to voice non-traditional Arab views about the Arab-Israeli conflict?
I detect a few questions there. We do regularly receive books about Middle Eastern history and politics. I'm never concerned about political pushback. If it's a good book and stands peer review, then we will publish it. I would say that obviously I don't read every book that my company publishes, but I would say that they are solid works, whether they argue from the left or from the right. At AUB, where I was on the faculty for 11 years, there was, when I got there, and this is actually a telling difference, a substantial culture of intellectual freedom. You could say just about anything you wanted. I had colleagues who would get grumpy if Edward Said were criticized, for example, but it was never anything serious. Within the last 5 years, we now have what I would describe as a woke administration, which is beginning to impose a lot of these American standards on a student population that's overwhelmingly Lebanese and a faculty that's overwhelmingly non-American. And one of the more frequent comments about this was that they found this to be colonialist. So just a very trite example, when we had a universal all-campus anti-smoking ban, all right, this was just like absolutely unintelligible to Lebanon because it's one of the most tobacco-saturated countries in the world. And they reacted to this like they were being told what to do essentially by white males in their own society with a legacy of colonialism from the French Mandate. And so the answer to this was we all smoked in our offices and nobody really paid any attention to it. But it was that type of thing. And also in the intellectual leadership, they got very careful about inclusive language. They had a Title IX office. They started with the gender studies program. It was a slowly wokeification of the university. And the administration, in my opinion, did tend to favor people who would step in line with that in a way that could be very obvious. So I would think in that way, it became more prejudicial. But in terms of scholarship, to be quite honest, the administrations have abdicated from any sort of intellectual leadership. They're much more interested in fundraising. Like a university president today is essentially a Sharpie whose worth is acting like a riverboat shyster to bring in money for his university. And if he's good at that, his board of trustees will retain him. And if he's bad at that, they'll get rid of him. But that's the only criterion.
I want to keep that phrase for future essays. I have
which one?
Riverboat shysters, etc.
I like that one, but I like that one better than nobody knows what a Sharpie is anymore. But riverboat shyster, I think we still have showboat and stuff like this.
Before I go on to another question, does anybody want to respond to this? No? Okay. A question for Professor Wax then, from Thomas Deneen. There was a letter signed by over 30 of your fellow Penn Law faculty members several years ago condemning some of your statements about race and culture. Did you find anyone in the Penn community willing to support you, either publicly or more likely privately? Are you or the other panelists aware of potential allies in academia who were silenced by fear of repercussions?
Well, yeah, there were a handful of people, but only a handful who were willing to defend me, although the vast majority kept a low profile for obvious reasons. One was my stellar donor, Paul Levy, big donor to the law school, a guy who works in finance, and he was very vocal about his critique of the way Penn had behaved. He even resigned from the board of trustees as in response to it. But most of the other support was quite muted. What's interesting, I think, is that the administration and my dean were just completely impervious to any of that criticism. I think for several reasons. The first is that they are really terrified of the minority students and the whole, constituency surrounding those minority students. They basically do their bidding, and if they want someone chided or canceled or have their classes taken away or to be stripped of their committee assignments and ideally to fire them, because there was a lot of pressure to fire me, but I do have tenure, then they will mostly get what they want. And the second problem is a problem that I'm more and more aware of, which I've called the little Caitlin problem, which is at the end of the day, People want their kids to get into Ivy institutions and to graduate from them. And frankly, they don't care all that much about what happens in between. Bari Weiss just did a blistering piece. I forget where, it might be Quillette or one of those places.
It was in the City Journal.
The City Journal, that's absolutely right, about what's happening in private, expensive private schools, places like Riverdale and, Harvard Westlake. They've gone completely over to this anti-racist woke ideology, and the parents are afraid to speak up, and they are afraid to speak up partly because they are afraid of their fellow parents. This is all about social pressure. But the main reason is that these schools hold the keys to the kingdom in college admissions. And that is everything. I mean, really, these schools, excuse my expression, they have parents by the balls, and they're afraid to do anything. And I don't know. I mean, this is a terrible situation. We
Amy,
have
you should come see my son's school in Palm Beach.
a bunch of bottom feeder
We're not like that.
traders running the show here.
Yeah.
We have the opposite experience. We are in a town that voted 2/3 for President Trump in the last election. And
Well, we need, the problem is that the high profile, big name schools, the names we all recognize, they, have all gone in the opposite direction. It's a collective action problem
Yeah.
because we need a massive parent rebellion.
I would agree that in the blue states that's true, but this is the oldest private school in Florida. When we detect a hint of wokeness, we have a rather militant parent committee that takes the headmaster.
Please send me the name of that school.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and you should come see it. It's like a model of what education should be, and I say this as the father of a kindergartner.
Good to hear it. That's hard.
But I understand it is rare, and reading Barry's article made me feel very depressed.
I'm going to interrupt with another question, not for Dr. Murray, although I have one or two on tap for him. I think for all of you, can American nationalism help with these problems?
I think it could, but the whole idea of American nationalism is now so taboo that if you advocate American nationalism as such, you're going to be called a white supremacist and a racist and a whole bunch of other terrible things. And we saw that recently with this idea that we should have patriotic education. It's like, what do you mean patriotic education? To me, that shouldn't even be controversial. It's not fascist indoctrination. It's just sort of like giving an accurate and prideful history of your own country, which most other countries do. In France, for example, you are taught to be proud of the history of France and the cultural achievements of the French people. And this is not a controversial act. It's not even a political act. But if you advocated that in an American history department today, I couldn't imagine doing it. It would be like so off the wall that I just don't think anybody would take that sort of risk.
See, America has had a unique history in this regard. I'm reminded of Richard Hofstadter's famous bon mot that it has been America's fate as a nation not to have ideologies, but to be one. And he was speaking about a history. He was correct about that history when he said it back sometime in the 1950s. And so you could have somebody like Bill Buckley, who would say that he yielded to no one in the degree of his patriotism, but there was not 1 ounce of nationalism in it. And what Bill meant by that was that he was devoted to the American ideology, the American creed, equal human dignity, equal under the law, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the source of patriotism. Now we are in a situation where the American creed is a phrase that the younger members of this group probably never actually heard used in live conversation before. And so being patriotic is increasingly conflated with nationalism. And I, being a hopeless old fogey, am with Bill Buckley. I'm as patriotic as you can be, but I'm patriotic about the idea of America, not about the physical borders of the country.
Can I just make a comment about this? I mean, when woke people hear the word nationalism, they see red. I mean, there is a concerted campaign to, just tar and vilify this concept, which means that it must be dangerous. But I think that the broader question is whether we are allowed to admire and venerate our Western civilizational legacy, because out of which our national creed, our national identity, our national reality comes, because we are the inheritors of that post-Enlightenment tradition, and in our own unique way. But I have seen that saying anything good about Western Civ is verboten and considered an incredible threat. And to point out all the achievements and accomplishments of the West and of European culture, which of course invented modernity and is responsible for 95% of what we enjoy every day. I mean, that just isn't done. I assign to my students in a conservatism seminar that I teach Charles Murray's book, Human Accomplishment, which I urge you to take a look at if you want a sort of pro-Western Civ tract. It's just eye-opening to look at all his charts and his data. And, for the students, it's just, this is considered completely renegade and countercultural to point out that, yes, we have left other parts of the globe and other cultures and civilizations in the dust. And this doesn't say anything about, the moral dignity of every person, political equality, legal equality. No, not at all. It's just a fact. So what's the implication here? Well, instead of running down Western Civ, we ought to be determined to preserve, protect, and defend it.
Yeah, thanks for signing Human Accomplishment. We all have, who write books, we all have our own favorites. And I've always thought that my abused child was the bell curve, but my neglected child was Human Accomplishment. And I'm delighted that you have noticed it and used it.
I will just follow up with that with a question to Dr. Murray, since I have been going around. Dr. Murray, how can society function if ethnomathematics takes hold? No one answer to a problem, no showing work, etc.
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing the first part of the question. Would you say it again?
How can society function if ethnomathematics takes hold?
Oh, that's the word that I didn't quite hear. Ethnomath. The science fiction writer, what's his name? He had his definition of reality. And reality is that which, when we stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And I got news for you. Math is that thing which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And there are a whole variety of things that are coming out now in the ethnomathematics being one of them, but a whole bunch of others that are simply out of whack with reality. And I look upon them as temporary phenomena that we will outgrow. I'm actually, on a broader scale, I'm strategically optimistic, even though I'm tactically depressed. I really do think that truth wins out in the end in the sciences, that it takes a long time sometimes, or at least it takes a few decades sometimes, but often it happens quickly. And I think it's driven by something that is characteristic of academics and drives a lot of their behavior. And since I have a whole bunch of academics listening to me, they can fact check me to see whether it applies to them and their colleagues. That when we get up in the morning and we shave or put on our lipstick or whatever we do, we aren't worried so much about how many papers we've written and how many citations we've had relative to our colleagues. That academics are really want to be seen as smart by their fellow academics. So they want to be respected for their intellectual prowess and ability. And at some point, if you hold certain positions, you lose the respect of your colleagues because you are espousing as your intellectual conclusions things that are just silly nonsense. No one except somebody with an IQ of 140 plus could make themselves believe in this sort of thing. And so I have confidence that the science is uncovering all sorts of things that are true and relevant, and that's going to continue and even accelerate. And it will force an awful lot of people who right now are as woke as can be to change their minds because they don't want to lose the respect of their colleagues.
I think that's
I'm just a Pollyanna-ish guy. That's me.
No, I think that is absolutely true, Charles. And I think what we have now, though, is that people will suppress opinions that are unpopular for precisely the same reason. They want to be seen as smart, and to advocate something that's anti-progressive or anti-woke can lead one to be dismissed as retrograde or regressive, lacking intellectual vigor, not engaging with theories that are popular with your colleagues. And what it is to me is an exercise in groupthink. And yeah, it is a big problem. I've known people, professional colleagues and others, who invested an enormous amount of their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth, their personal identity in their role as an academic. And that was largely based on the approval of their colleagues. I stopped caring because fundamentally, in my position, it didn't matter anymore. Who cares if they like my ideas? When would I ever see these people? And what possible consequences would there be for me? But very many will get depressed, will feel great anxiety, will have enormous amounts of problems. And this has been quantified in some very unpleasant ways. I don't know of any statistics in the United States, but among British academics, 54% self-report some sort of mental health issue. Self-report. I don't know about the other 46%. Do they need to be diagnosed? I don't know. And do the 54% get better or worse after they have whatever it is or proceed in their careers? But that's an enormous problem. That you're fundamentally you can get very emotionally dependent on what your colleagues think of you.
And if you no longer have a critical mass of colleagues who are devoted to who do make their judgments based on the authentic, rigorous, brilliance of their colleagues. If you are part of a department where everybody is being silly, then I guess you don't get the kind of peer incentives that I'm talking about. And this is part of what you say, you know what? At some point, you are going to have these very weak social science departments with very mediocre people saying very foolish things. At some time, the scorn of the people who are still doing, the grown-ups who are still doing serious work, at some point that scorn is going to become impossible to ignore.
Yeah. And I think,
I wish I can agree with this, but I really see things trending in an opposite direction. These departments and academia generally is now being peopled by individuals in these sacred, untouchable classes, females, minorities, and the like, and they are given an enormous pass on just simple analytical, mistakes. I mean, howlers. I mean, any presentation. So the whole equity business, which essentially boils down to every disparity, that every disadvantage is due to racism, and no other explanations are really allowed, including anything that assigns responsibility to the individuals themselves who are disadvantaged. So that is the new orthodoxy. And, what that means is that the most obvious controls, the most obvious alternative hypotheses simply are not allowed to be entertained. I mean, it has required this religious, ritualistic quality that the conversation has to go a certain way. And the people who are presenting this stuff are not to be challenged. I think the bottom line is the number of people who care about getting the facts right and getting at the truth in academia is just dwindling by the day. That is not what it's about anymore. That is not what it's about. It's about peddling and selling and spreading an ideology.
Yeah. I was lucky. My department was small and rather undistinguished. So we didn't have that type of counter pressure. But Amy's absolutely right. I mean, you do see this in larger disciplines and in larger specializations. I think that's very true.
I'm going to come in with another question here, which in some ways I think builds on this, from Terry Gannon. What do you think is the ultimate motivation of woke, the end goal? Seems entirely political and appears more a Marxist culture war. There's a question mark, but maybe that should be an exclamation mark.
Well, I think fundamentally it's about power. Like to be able to arbitrate what is correct and what is incorrect, to be able to regulate people's behaviors. And if you can leave aside academia for a moment, when you see this in corporations or in public institutions, it is very much about convincing people that they need to toe a particular line. And if you can get them to believe in something like gender fluidity, you can get them to believe in just about anything else, right? It's a litmus test of loyalty. And what you're trying to do is create this administrative managerial caste. I resist calling it an elite because it really doesn't control capital. It just sort of administers our society. But to try to create a group like that that is terrorized into submission, I think that's the real lesson of Orwell. Your ability to control your state depends on your ability to terrorize your upper middle class. And without that, it all falls apart. So it is very much about power and control. And you're right to mention Marxism, Ted, because Marxism does see, the historical theory of Marxism does see everything in terms of power struggles, of class struggles, struggles between oppressors and oppressed, and group politics, moving things forward. Within the discipline of history, there's very little room for interpreting it differently if you're approaching it from that perspective. And if you believe that the future of progress is determined by power, then determining your present and indeed your future is also about a power struggle. So even these questions of right or wrong, do scholars from disadvantaged groups get a big pass? It doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter, because what they're doing is, to put it in their terminology, speaking their truth. And their truth is very different from objective truth, from empirical truth. We start hearing, and we've been talking a bit about the sciences today, there is this phrase, white science. Science doesn't have a race, but if you advocate these unpopular positions, you can be easily dismissed by having somebody describe you as a white scientist who does white science, and therefore you're wrong and shouldn't be considered.
I fully endorse Paul's characterization of what wokeism is all about. It's power.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, Amy, again.
Yeah, I agree. I agree it is about power, but I think that that leaves the question of why it has the content that it does, right? So why it has devolved into kind of, for a lack of a better term, white self-denigration, self-abnegation, debasement, and the valorization of, diversity and of identity politics, and of this special solicitude towards supposedly oppressed peoples. And, that is a very profound and difficult question with a very complex answer. But I think really the operant word here is guilt. And I was discussing this last night on a podcast with Paul Gottfried, who's written a lot about this. I think it's rooted in this obsession with the crimes that Western civ has committed, and undoubtedly has, which crowds out any awareness of all of the virtues and upsides of our traditions for some reason. And I think that comes out of a Protestant thread of thought and feeling that has been imported into this country and is part of its founding, which is one of self-criticism and self-improvement and inward introspection and guilt. I mean, these threads are there. It has, this is not a new observation, has a quasi-religious aspect to it. It's not a color that I see, so to speak. I mean, I don't understand it at all. I don't share that psychology, but I am stunned at how many people have gone over to it. People I know, people I went to school with, people I live with and work with, people in my class and station, upper middle class professional people. I think that story has yet to be told.
Yeah, and I think it's just easy. You're given a sort of prescribed list of things you're supposed to feel bad about, and if you do a good job of feeling bad about them, then you're either left alone or you're valorized yourself as part of a solution. And what the interesting thing is, of course, about this entire wokeness, we can say it's about power. I have yet to see a description from a woke person or a progressive about what that future would look like. Who would arbitrate disputes in a woke future? What would the powers of government be in a woke future? It's a question they never answered because I don't believe there's any end to it. The end is power itself. And whatever shifting values they have, and we have already seen this, I think, in the past few years, the things they believe in actually have considerably changed. It was 3 years ago, for example, this was much more about gender, whereas now it's much more about race. And that's much easier, I think. And then once they find the path of least resistance, they just go along with it, and they give you these things you're supposed to believe in and repeat and say you support. And if you do it, we'll give you all the awards, and we'll say what a nice person you are. And if you refuse, then we'll call you a retrograde fool and try to get you fired from your professorship and do all these bad things to you. Right? And we have a lot of social science on sacrifices among primordial peoples. So if you really like Levi Strauss and this, they actually that look at this and say, oh my goodness, we need victims to be sacrificed to create unit cohesion.
In other words, The Wicker Man turned out to be a how-to manual, for those of you who saw that movie. I am going to go to a practical question, if I may. Interrupting, and please pardon. Jack Katz, what are the prospects for developing publishing and research funding outside of universities?
Huge. I live in a town with 35 billionaires, let me tell you.
Well, please do tell us practically. This is actually very much something we would love to hear. I would love to hear.
Oh, sure. And I think this is actually the encouraging part of the story. There is a huge amount of wealth and capital in this country and around the world that is sick and tired of hearing this wokeness come. So when they approach intellectual exercises, they're beginning to realize that this is in fact important, and this is something they should play a role in. It's starting to be a kind of race of who can fund what, and how can we shape institutions to be more fair about freedom of speech? How can we recover some of our intellectual heritage? And once you start meeting those people and having those conversations, it becomes quite easy. I think the problem is that there's sort of a bottleneck in communications. There are very few people who can cross that academic divide into the private sector and actually talk to a CEO about why the discipline of history matters. As a publisher, this is something I can very much do. I don't get written off as a loony academic. They take me seriously as like a business owner and operator, and also somebody who has more ideas than just publishing books. So there actually is a massive potential. I just think it's underutilized and unexplored, and that's I think something that we could focus on, trying to build, if you will, a counterculture to the wokeness. And what I see among younger people, I've been doing some work with the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. Roger Scruton, the late British philosopher, had a massive following among very young people, people in their 20s and 30s, who were totally dissatisfied with academic philosophy and found a real resonance in his works, which sell huge numbers of copies. Many of them are still in print, and they're very successful. So somebody like that who could get into the more popular audiences really could make a huge difference in what we're seeing. And there is a great deal of interest circulating around us, especially in places like Palm Beach, where I am, where you have a relatively conservative population that wants their ideas to be heard and hears these cancel culture stories and are just disgusted. And I do think these cancel culture stories are the best tactic. And if people noticed, President Trump said in his CPAC speech last week that cancel culture is something that he's very much opposed to, and it got one of the loudest ovations in the entire speech. That's something people can relate to because they feel that they're being told what to think, what to believe in, and it's un-American, and people still recognize that as un-American.
Thank you.
Say that I agree with all of this. I think there is a lot of money out there that could be directed to more anti-woke pushback. But on the other hand, I think one of the challenges is to wean people away from their devotion and fetishizing of the Ivy League. I mean, just the whole Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are still raking in massive amounts of money and also fidelity to their alma maters. I know people who are very conservative in their dispositions, and yet they're still giving money to these institutions. And I tell them, stop. This is very counterproductive. Please do not do that. I mean, in part, they're doing it so that their children and their grandchildren will, be looked upon with favor. But in part, they're doing it because they don't really know what's going on. I mean, the mainstream media is very, very good at hiding the truth about what is really going on in academia. They don't use the term cancel culture. You won't see the term woke. You will not actually see any honest reporting about the dire straits that academia is in and the orthodoxies that prevail. There's another thing going on, which is that men and women, upper middle class people with money, differ in their political profiles, and that's a problem. Women are much more left. And a lot of these finance guys with the big bucks, they are married to what I call the pussy hat brigade. Women who are much farther left than they are, who have a strong bleeding heart tendency, are not perhaps as well informed or knowledgeable about the intricacies of policy and politics. And they have an influence over these guys. It is a baleful influence, I'm sorry to say. I know I'm speaking very frankly here. But this is my observation. So I don't know what to do about that war between the sexes, but it is a problem.
Thank you. I have an enormous number of wonderful questions, which I don't think I have time to get to. So I'm going to ask if each of you could just have like a last concluding remark you might want to say before we wrap up our presentation. Let's do that in reverse order this time, just for fun, or do you want to do it in the same order you started out in?
Nothing occurs to me that I really wanted to say that I haven't said, but I'll just add one coda onto Amy's remarks about somehow getting the elite universities to be less prestigious. They may solve this for us. Now, this won't happen quickly. The reason Goldman Sachs interviews at Harvard and doesn't interview at Iowa State, speaking as an Iowan, is not because they think Harvard has given such a great education to these kids. It's because the kids got into Harvard. And so that's a very densely populated pool of really smart kids. And to the extent that Harvard stops being a place that is populated by really, really smart kids, Goldman Sachs is going to be less interested in them. The parents will still want to send their kids to Harvard. But a lot of the reasons that Harvard has the position it has are going to slowly be watered down if it no longer serves that signaling function. And Harvard just may do an unintentional harakiri on itself in this regard. Devoutly to be wished.
Thank you. Yes, Amy?
There's
You're muted.
potentially to say, so I'll just very briefly, I agree that it will be interesting to see what happens to the Ivies. They're pretty shrewd operators, and I don't know how much self-destruction they're really going to engage in because they have a good thing going here. But we'll see how it plays out. And I think it would be a wonderful thing if we have more of a dispersion of talent than we have now. This kind of bunching up, as Charles has shown, is very, very unhealthy. Let me add, this is a tribute to James Flynn, and he certainly deserves that tribute. But I also want to issue a tribute to Charles Murray, who really is unique and valuable, and we will not see the like of him again. And I will tell you that in teaching my conservatism class, I have just every year appreciated more and more since his publication, Coming Apart, which is a prescient masterpiece, and it calls the trends before anybody else. And my students greatly appreciate that book. They have, I've given them snippets, but several of them have said, "Oh, I had to buy this book, and I couldn't put it down."
Thank
So
you.
thank you for that.
Dr. de Quenoy?
All right, so I do think we've touched on something that is very important. How do we sort of de-prestigize the Ivy League? And I agree with Charles. I think they are doing this very much on their own. It's slow and it's subtle, but what I notice among people with students or children who are about to become college students is that they're not that interested in the prestige factor of an institution as not as much as they were when I was going to school. But what they're rather looking into is the particular programs of study that they want. And one example in my field is the best place to study in the United States to study the French Revolution and Napoleonic era is now Florida State University, because it has an extremely elaborate and well-endowed center and library of that. And the very best people in that field are now working there. And you would never have assumed that before. And this, I think, is just one sort of systemic change. Amy might be aware that the number 6 law school for international law is Florida International University in Miami, which barely registered on anybody's radar screen when I was applying to college in the 1990s. So I do think we're seeing a decentralization of elite status, a diminishing of the importance of elite status, and I think perhaps worryingly, a diminishment of universities generally. Like I said, 95% of Americans 40 years ago believed college education was absolutely essential, whereas today it's 45%. And I think if you want to learn more and also how to fight wokeness, I'll again hold up Jim's book. I like the graphic, which Jim actually designed. You can't really see it on the Zoom, but what this is a generic sort of Gothic university building. And this is a missile flying toward it. And on the missile is written speech code. So it's widely available on Amazon, and it's a book everyone should read.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. And this is, yes, it's been a wonderful memorial for James Flynn. Thank you, all three of you, so much for that. That is the primary purpose of this, and I'm so glad that was accomplished. I will just close, in addition to saying the thank yous, to tell everybody who's watching that, again, you can send any queries unanswered or different to the panelists to me, Randall at nas.org, and I will be glad to forward them. If you can't, if the spelling doesn't work, then contact at nas.org also works. And that also, this has been recorded. It will be available on the YouTube channel of the NAS, and I think we'll post advertising for it in different aspects of our publicity as well. So I'll just close and say thank you, all of you, so very much. It's been wonderful to hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
I'm very